You're listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. Our guest today is ARI Berman, a senior reporter for Mother Jones magazine and a fellow at the Nation Institute. He's written extensively about American politics, voting rights, and the intersection of money and politics. His most recent book is Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. ARI Berman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You're an expert on voting rights in the U.S. A national narrative kind of exists when it comes to civil rights, voting rights, that says, notwithstanding setbacks and residual racism, things have gotten a lot better since the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. How do you assess that narrative, and how would you characterize the overall trajectory of voting rights since 1965?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that narrative. Things have gotten better, but that's only part of the narrative. So some people only want to focus on one part of the narrative, which is all the progress that we've made. But there's a second part to that narrative, which is that there's still a lot of barriers to voting and a lot of barriers to civil rights today. And we're seeing those barriers play out right now. I mean, I wrote a book about the fight for voting rights since 1965, and there were fights over voting rights in 1970, 1975, and 1980. I mean, every year after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, there were fights over voting, and those fights have only become magnified today, where there's debates over new efforts to make it harder to vote. Things like voter ID laws, or cutting back on early voting, or purging the voting rolls, or making it harder to register to vote. So I would say, notwithstanding the progress that we've made, there are some very influential people that are interested in trying to block or derail or overturn that progress. And there are people out there that have launched a very concerted, well-organized effort, particularly in the states, to try to make it harder for certain people to vote. So the idea that we've just overcome all of those barriers, that would be a very naive and inaccurate view of where the country is right now.
Mm-hmm. And what are the most worrying developments on the voting rights front right now?
Well, if you just look what has happened in recent years, since the 2010 election, 24 states, so basically half the country, have passed new restrictions on voting, whether it's requiring strict forms of ID that millions of voters don't have, or cutting back on the amount of time that people have to vote, or making it more difficult to register to vote. I mean, the cumulative effect of these policies are on millions of people. It's not just like a little thing here or a little thing there. And then in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, really the centerpiece of the civil rights movement, and ruled that those states with the longest histories of discrimination no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. And so this has kind of been a two-faceted war. There have been new laws that have been passed to make it more difficult to vote, and then the laws that were preventing discrimination were themselves gutted. And that's very worrisome. And we saw a lot of this stuff play out in 2018 in states like Georgia, where people were forced to wait on very long lines, people were removed from the voter rolls, people had their ballots challenged, and it's crazy to me that in the year in 2018, we're still fighting about this stuff. A lot of people felt like the Voting Rights Act was supposed to settle these debates about voting, but they're only becoming more intense as we move on.
Voter ID laws are usually rationalized with reference to voter fraud. What do we know about the actual incidence of voter fraud? Is it something that we should really be worried about, or is it just a smokescreen to justify the disenfranchisement of various constituencies?
Voter fraud is exceedingly rare, particularly the kind of voter fraud we're seeing, which is in-person voting, which is the kind of thing a voter ID law would stop. Mm-hmm. That almost never happens. So you're more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to impersonate another voter. And this has been in the news recently because down in North Carolina, there seems to be a case of election fraud where absentee ballots were taken and thrown out, presumably by Republican operatives, and they may have also forged absentee ballots to increase the number. That is not voter fraud in the sense of a voter going out and committing fraud. That is a few bad actors essentially going out and committing fraud on voters. So it's more of a criminal scheme than it is evidence of fraud, and that's the kind of thing, interesting enough, that a voter ID law wouldn't stop, because it was done through people collecting absentee ballots and then essentially trashing them. And so what I find interesting is that Republicans have essentially falsely accused Democrats of stealing elections for quite some time, but we really heard a lot of this rhetoric in 2018, where Donald Trump and Rick Scott and Marco Rubio and very influential figures in the Republican Party cast doubts on the legitimacy of the election in states like Florida, so that we shouldn't be recounting ballots, that ballots shouldn't count after Election Day. And then here you had this essentially criminal scheme by North Carolina Republicans to throw out people's ballots to try to help win in a congressional race. So I would say voter fraud, broadly speaking, almost never occurs. There are every once in a while targeted criminal schemes aimed at voters, like we're seeing in North Carolina, but the laws that are being passed by Republicans don't actually address it. And the fraud itself, ironically enough, is being committed by the party that claims to be protecting the sanctity of the ballot.
It's good that you mentioned Florida, because I had a question about Florida. I read your book. In that book, you provide an account of the 2000 election, which ended with the Supreme Court halting the recount in Florida, effectively giving the election to George W. Bush. And when we think about this election, as you know in the book, we typically think about the hanging chads and the butterfly ballots and the Jewish voters in Florida who ended up voting for Pat Buchanan by accident. But you describe something that I think has faded from memory, namely that just prior to the election, thousands of African-American voters in Florida were purged from the voter rolls on the basis of these false matches with a list of convicted felons. And when it came time in Congress to certify the election, House members of the Congressional Black Caucus attempted to contest the result on this basis, but no Democratic senators were willing to support the complaint, and Al Gore himself, who was presiding over the session in his capacity as vice president, he refused to accept these challenges. So why didn't Gore and the Democrats fight harder to oppose what, on your telling, was a very clear and highly consequential case of voter suppression? And does this failure tell us something about whether it's even possible to fight back against disenfranchisement as it's happening?
Well, that's a really good question. So as you laid out, in the run-up to the 2000 election in Florida, Florida was one of only a handful of states that prevented ex-felons from voting. And the state of Florida claimed that thousands of ex-felons were on the voter rolls and needed to be purged. The problem was that this purge was very inaccurate, that people were wrongly labeled ex-felons, that you had registered eligible voters who were confused with felons, even though they had totally different names, and that there was a disproportionate impact on African Americans, who were only 11% of Florida's electorate, but 44% of those on the voter purge list. So on Election Day 2000, amidst all the other drama, people showed up, they were wrongly told they were felons, they were prevented from voting. After the election, the NAACP sued the state of Florida, and the state of Florida conceded that 12,000 registered voters, which was 22 times George W. Bush's 537 vote margin of victory, were purged from the voting rolls and prevented from voting. The problem was that a lot of this evidence emerged after the election. So we didn't know these things. A lot of these things were unknown.
Can you ever know such things?
Well, we know a lot in Florida because of the lawsuits that were done, because there were actually numbers here. I mean, the state said, we purged 12,000 people, and we knew there was a disparate impact on African Americans, and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission did a major investigation. A lot of times you don't know. I mean, this is one of the things that...
But these are things that you find out after the fact, right?
It usually takes a long time.
Mm-hmm. And then the damage is done.
And then the damage is done, and there was a tremendous amount of pressure on Gore to concede. He didn't have the same data that he had 6 months after the election, right afterwards. Everyone was focused on the hanging chads and the butterfly ballots, and no one was even thinking about all of the people that were wrongly labeled ex-felons. But, I mean, we just kind of went through a similar situation in Georgia like this, where there were a ton of election issues. There were 15,000 votes separating Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp from going to a runoff. And basically, Abrams said, there are a lot of voting problems. I can't prove that it was over 15,000 and that it would have, otherwise I would have been in the runoff. So I have to concede, but clearly something's not right here. And my guess is if we're talking about Georgia in 6 months to a year, we're going to know a lot more. That you're going to have time to crunch the numbers. There are going to be academic analyses of what goes on. There are going to be more court cases. But unfortunately, in real time, you don't know these things.
So what policies, what laws could be adopted to prevent a situation like that from recurring, or is there nothing you can do?
Well, I think just in general, we need more protections for voting rights, and we need to encourage laws that make it easier for people to vote. So whether that's making it easier for people to register to vote through things like automatic or election day registration, giving more people more time to vote so there's shorter lines and less confusion. So things like early voting, whether it's protections against voter purging, so people aren't wrongly removed from the voter rolls. That's been an issue for a long time, and it seems to only be getting worse. Making it easy for people to get IDs if you're going to require it. I mean, the problem isn't requiring IDs. The problem is requiring IDs that people don't have. Like if the government said you have to have an ID, but everyone's going to get one, it wouldn't be as big of a deal. The problem is states are passing these laws and not making it easy to get the IDs. You have a situation in states like Texas, you can vote with a gun permit, but not a student ID. I mean, that clearly seems to be aimed at one group of voters more than another. In Wisconsin, you can vote with a Wisconsin ID, but if you just move there from Illinois, you can't vote with an Illinois ID. I mean, so it's not just that people don't have ID, it's that it's a quote unquote right ID that you need, that certain people, whether it's African Americans or poor folks or young people or students, don't have the same IDs in a way that someone who's maybe an affluent white Republican might have. So my worry is that we're in some ways moving in two different directions, because if you look at the last election, there were 7 states that passed ballot initiatives to make it easier to vote. So clearly there was a yearning among voters, not just in blue states, but in red states.
Including in Florida.
Which overturned the felon disenfranchisement law we were just talking about, which was huge. I mean, you had Florida vote for a Republican senator, a Republican governor, and 65% of Floridians vote for a law that would essentially overturn a law that cost Al Gore the election in the state.
Is that going to radically transform the next election in Florida?
Well, we'll see. Florida Republicans are already trying to weaken the law, so we have to see how it's going to be implemented. Also, there's going to be a new pool of people, but they're going to have to be registered, and they're going to have to vote. And it remains to be seen how many will register, who will register them. So I don't know. I mean, it could transform the state. It depends on how the law is implemented, and it depends on whether the resources are there to get people out to vote. I do know that we started off the election before anyone had even cast a ballot, with 1.4 million people and higher not being able to vote. So, I mean, the electorate was contracted from the very beginning. Now the electorate will expand. And I don't know which party that will benefit, but from a pro-democracy perspective, which is what I care about, I think it's great that up to 1 million people might get the right to vote back. And I think it's great that people will get a second chance in society and aren't judged forever based on one mistake they made. Because I was down in Florida reporting on this ballot initiative, and I met people that had never even gone to prison, but they can't vote for the rest of their lives. That doesn't strike most people, regardless of their political affiliation, as fair.
On NPR the other day, you identified 5 main voter suppression tactics: voter ID laws, voter purges, closing polling places, disenfranchising felons, as we just talked about, blocking voter registration. What about redistricting?
That's related. So I don't think of it as a voting restriction so much, but it has the same effect. And I mean, the difference I think with redistricting is that both parties are guilty of doing it, although I think Republicans have done it worse and are in control of more states, but it's certainly a bipartisan problem depending on where you are. That was another thing that changed in 2018. 5 states passed laws to make it harder to gerrymander, including some red states like Missouri and Utah. So I think in general, people in both parties are fed up with this process. Not the politicians themselves. They like it. They want to stay in power. But I think the everyday voter is like, why should politicians be choosing their own electorate, essentially? And you just see the difference in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a state that was heavily gerrymandered. The state Supreme Court threw out the maps. Instead of Pennsylvania having a 13-5 Republican advantage in the congressional delegation, it's 9-9 now. It's a 50-50 state, which is what Pennsylvania should be. It should be a state where that's roughly even in its political representation, because it's a swing state, not where one party, by virtue of drawing the maps, has a huge majority for the next decade. And even we saw this in the last election, where in heavily gerrymandered states, I mean, you look at states like Wisconsin and Michigan, Democrats got more votes for the state legislatures. They elected Democratic governors, and yet Republicans retained their majorities in the state house. In Wisconsin, Democrats got 54% of the vote for the state legislature in Wisconsin, but Republicans got 63% of the seats. I mean, that's not democracy. I mean, we like to think democracy is the party that gets the most votes gets the most seats, and that's not how it works because of gerrymandering.
You've written about Republicans in North Carolina, among other places, using majority-minority districts, inflating majority-minority districts to dilute the minority vote in swing districts, and so they can win more seats. So on the one hand, majority-minority districts help ensure descriptive representation for African Americans in Congress. And then on the other hand, they're also used to help Republicans win more seats. So is there a kind of trade-off between descriptive representation for African Americans and maybe the class representation for those same, or kind of like other forms of economic representation, or however you would put it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that I'm not sure there's a good answer for. I think majority-minority districts were really important in the 80s and 90s where there was no black representation. I mean, you just weren't going to get African Americans elected to Congress in places like North Carolina without drawing districts that had where minorities were a majority of voters. I mean, that was just the reality of it. If that meant taking power away from white Democrats who had been there for decades, then I didn't have a problem with that because there was no other way to boost black representation. I think what Republicans have done more recently is they've made majority-minority districts that are already represented by minorities even more heavily minority, which the minority candidates themselves don't like. So there used to be what was called this unholy alliance between essentially black Democrats and white Republicans, that you would draw more districts for black Democrats and you draw more districts for white Republicans. That alliance has essentially broken down, where black Democrats are saying, we already have these districts. We don't need to take a 55% black district and make it 70% African American. That's just going to hurt Democrats, broadly speaking, and it's not going to help us because we're already in here. So I think that majority-minority districts, while necessary in the past, I think have gotten skewed some. And I think that the black Democrats that represent these districts would probably be the first people to tell you that. And that's why these districts have been struck down as racial gerrymandering. And in fact, you had, in the last election cycle, it was very strange because you had white Republicans saying, oh, we're just drawing these districts to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And then you had black Democrats saying, essentially, don't racially gerrymander me. I'm okay already.
My understanding of how the laws work, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that racial gerrymandering is illegal, but partisan gerrymandering is not. And given that race boundaries and partisan boundaries are largely overlapping, how can a racial gerrymander be discovered or denied?
Well, that is right. Sometimes it's just obvious. Sometimes it's obvious that, like, there was a majority of African Americans or Latinos in a district and they should have representation, and you just didn't draw the district that way. That's pretty obvious to see. Sometimes it's more complicated. In a state like Wisconsin, for example, it's largely white, and there are districts that are heavily gerrymandered but not on a racial basis. And the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, has been unwilling to invalidate that. I think that's problematic because, as you mentioned, there is a large overlap between race and party. I also think that denying someone a district based on their race and denying someone a district based on their party are both ills. They're both wrongs. I think one is more disturbing because there's a long history of discrimination in this country. But partisan gerrymandering, whether it's done by Democrats in states like Maryland or whether it's done by Republicans in a state like Wisconsin, has just totally thrown the system out of whack. That states are not representative of who lives there anymore. And election results in way too many places are predetermined. And I mean, even in 2018, when 40 states flipped to Democrats in the House of Representatives, you had no congressional seats flipped to Democrats in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, because of gerrymandering. I mean, these were states that had extremely competitive statewide elections, but not a single congressional district flipped because there was so much gerrymandering that had gone on.
So what's your preferred methodology of drawing districts?
I don't think politicians should draw their districts. I mean, I don't think it matters. Should? I think independent commissions should draw them, and they should be actually independent. And that means, like in Iowa, they have a state demographer, and the state demographer draws the districts. They have all the data. They understand that there's political considerations. It's not like they don't take into account political considerations, but they basically look at, like, where are the communities of interest, where are the population centers, and they try to draw districts that are reasonably fair, reasonably compact. And so I think the overriding thing is, are these districts representative of their communities? Mm-hmm. Are they fair? Do they make logical sense? And then, if you can, are they competitive? Mm-hmm. Because if there's just a bunch of safe seats everywhere, that's not really good for democracy, and mm-hmm. it doesn't really give people much of a reason to vote in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm. I want to end with a speculative question. Imagine a world in which the U.S. were to adopt the model that is used in Australia, where voting, not just voter registration, but voting itself, is mandatory for every citizen. If every U.S. citizen voted in every U.S. election, how do you think that would change our politics? How would it change the Republican Party, or the Democratic Party for that matter? Would it lead to a fundamental transformation in the character of the country?
Well, I think the political system would be a lot more representative of the people. And I also think when you make voting mandatory, you eliminate voter suppression, because if everyone has to vote legally by law, then you can't suppress people from voting. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon here in a country that is founded on notions of individual liberty.
Of course.
But I think it's an interesting thought experiment, because I think America likes to think that we're the greatest democracy in the world and every other country should follow our example. But our voting rules and our electoral system are among the most dysfunctional when it comes to advanced democracies. Whether it's having mandatory voting in Australia, or doing it like most of Europe, where they automatically register you to vote and they give everyone an ID card, so you've eliminated those two problems right there. Or a lot of places have Election Day as a national holiday, or they have voting on the weekends, or every school is a polling place. And these countries have voter turnouts of 70, 80, sometimes 90%. And in the U.S., in our best elections, we're at 70% turnout. We just had a historic turnout for the midterm elections, and we had 49% of the people vote. Mm-hmm. So we're patting our back for how well we did, and meanwhile, more than half the country decided not to vote for one reason or another in the last election.
Mm. Well, ARI Berman, thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.